Hello, American Seminar students. This is my, introduction and commentary on John Steinbeck's The Harvest Gypsies. This is where my expertise, my background reading, and really my passion for Steinbeck really comes into play. This is a period of his career that I've studied a lot of. I've read a ton of his letters. Uh, a lot of writing has come from this period, and it's such an important piece of what makes him a great American writer. The Harvest Gypsies is not something that's commonly read or assigned in schools, only because it's not fiction, but it's a collection of the journalism that he did just before the Grapes of Wrath. And in it, he is doing what Steinbeck does, which is being a voice for the voiceless. He is trying to provide a picture from a downtrodden class that most of America was simply unaware of, and he wanted to make them aware. Just want to take a look at my notes here. He did this writing right after Of Mice and Men. That matters because Of Mice and Men was his first wildly successful book. He had become a national literary figure. He was famous now. He was well off. He had a ton of money coming in. He didn't need this. This project was actually a dangerous one for him because it was going to make him very unpopular with a lot of people with money. It was a huge risk for him. And if you go back and read his letters, he felt like this was something he had to do. This was the way he could fight injustice. And regardless of the personal cost, he was interested in making life better for these people who really had no other option, these migrant workers. And so I just have a ton of respect that he could have been doing a lot of other things right now, and instead he put himself at risk. There were threats on his life because he was exposing this injustice, which was the only real threat to people was their loss of money for very rich people. So I've got a ton of respect for Steinbeck for doing that and for being this voice of the voiceless. We've talked a lot in this class about organized labor, about unions, and you've seen in the last couple of units we did about why they were starting to matter, and you see it here. There's a huge push with these migrant workers to make sure that they cannot get organized, and you read that in this piece. Don't let them get organized. Don't let them form a union of any kind because you want to keep them poor and desperate and unable to fight for a living wage at all. And so it was seen as a very socialist, leftist, sort of communistic behavior to try to form a union and try to organize labor. And you see some of those themes that we have looked at in previous texts come to bear in this one as well. The way Steinbeck starts this essay, the first paragraph is this: there are at least 150,000 homeless migrants wandering up and down the state, and that is an army large enough to make it important to every person in the state. It almost seems like it's an American tradition that poor people only matter when there's so many of them that it affects people who aren't poor. When the larger national economy will suffer if poor people continue to suffer, then the nation wakes up. Well, Steinbeck is waking up the nation saying, get ready because this is a big enough number of poor people that it's going to affect you who are sitting there reading this piece of journalism comfortably with no idea that it's going to affect you. It continues to happen throughout America, and I'm sure the world. The poor don't matter until the number of poor are large enough to affect the pocketbook and the bank accounts and the stock prices of those with money. You see also in here this continuous theme. Again, it has very little to do with race. We studied racism. We studied a lot of the reasons that African Americans traditionally in America have been mistreated. But really, it comes down to the powerful trying to own the powerless. Even in The Color Purple, you had African Americans who were trying to oppress those who had less power. You had men trying to oppress women. So it's not a race thing necessarily, as much as it's a powerful trying to keep down the powerless. The powerful want to maintain their power and wealth, so they'll do whatever they can to make sure that those without power don't get it. that they don't get earning power, that they don't begin to start to make decisions. Because from this, you see the farm owners using the desperation of these migrant workers to control them. They needed them to be desperate. They needed them to be working simply to avoid starvation so they could keep their wages lower. And so there are many strategies used to keep them down. These were necessary workers. You couldn't have farming in California without them. And yet they were necessary and still degraded and abused and talked down about it and talked about as if they're this huge problem and they're dirty and they're immoral. Realistically, they're none of these things. But if you can label them that way, you can keep them down. So you have clear efforts in this to keep the poor poor, to abuse their desperate situation, to manipulate them in that way, and really use them to flood the job market. If you go back and read some other texts from that era, you had a lot of advertisements coming out of these farms all over the Midwest of the need for workers. And far more advertisements than even the number of workers that were necessary, because they knew it would flood the job market so that they could pay people half wages. And they were so desperate because they had used up every last penny they had to get to the farms that they had to earn something, even if it was only enough to half feed them. And so there's a huge manipulation of poor people because they are powerless. You'll see that in Steinbeck's conversations about these harvest gypsies. More than anything, you see the end of chapter 1, Steinbeck introducing his purpose here, and that purpose is he wants to humanize the poor. He wants to make America stop and look at the faces and the situations of individual families, not just see them as random poor people who are struggling. It's easy for Americans to ignore poverty, to ignore the plight of the downtrodden, if it's just this vague group of people who they've never met. Steinbeck wants to make readers throughout America, through his journalism, look directly into the faces of individuals who are in this situation, wants to make them consider that. And he wants to change the entire landscape of California agriculture by doing this. And he risked to do it. Steinbeck actually left his nice home, left his wife for a time to go and live in these migrant camps and to see it firsthand, as a way of saying, I know what's going on. I'm going to report this. This is so severe. America needs to see it. In a lot of ways, it reminds me of the opioid crisis. No one took that seriously until it became clear that it wasn't just somebody else's problem. It was everybody everywhere kind of knew somebody or someone like them who had succumbed to it. I remember a Time magazine issue where there were individual pictures taken of those who were addicted and those who had OD'd on opioids. And it wasn't until those people were humanized, not just as the vague term addicts, but as humans who were struggling, often because these drugs were marketed to doctors to push onto patients somehow unnecessarily. Until that happened, it wasn't really an issue in America that many people were willing to think about. And so this reminds me of that, this effort to humanize or to make you see them because you can't. And honestly, that's what a lot of this class has been about, giving you literature to see people in places and situations that you're unfamiliar with. Steinbeck just wants to make sure and do that with the poor, and specifically these migrant workers who are being manipulated because of their desperation, because starvation is following them, because they went from comfortable, well-earned, farm-owning families to sheer desperation based on weather, bad luck, and industrialization. So that's a little bit of a preview of what you'll see in this, and just a little response to the first article. I hope you're willing to dig into this and read and get a feel for it before we get into Of Mice and Men.